Hey, everybody, this is Mark,
And this is Justin.
and this is Awkward Fist Bump Productions. Boom.
Yeah.
Today we have honor, a true honor. Um, so I'm going to give you guys a little backstory about what happened. Um, I was on Facebook one day and I was scrolling through my news feed, and there was a guy in camis on my newsfeed, and I saw it was a podcast. So you guys know we run a YouTube channel / podcast, so I'm a little biased. I like good podcasts, and the fact that I did 13 years in the Army and I see a guy in camouflage uniform, I'm automatically interested. So I link into the podcast and I start listening to it, and it turns out to be this great podcast, and we'll get into that in a second. So I I find the guy that was responsible for the podcast. I shoot a tweet to him, and I'm like, "Hey, will you come on and please interview with us, because this is a great podcast and I want to get it out there. I want to get you more numbers of people watching it." And sure enough, he responds to me. I'd love to. Sends me a message. We start emailing back and forth. Little did I know at the time that this guy is a very awesome documentary filmmaker. Okay, so he has been nominated for an Academy Award in his filmmaking. He was also nominated for actually quite a few Emmys. He's won 2 Emmys. And if I'm wrong, correct me, please. But he's won 2 Emmys, and he was nominated for 2 more Emmys. Combat Diary, The Marines of Lima Company, which is a great documentary, as well
hmm
as Going to War, which was done with Sebastian Younger. And many of y'all will know the name Sebastian Younger on PBS. So I was like, wow, Awkward Fist Bump Productions has hit gold here. So without further ado, let's talk about the podcast. I'm going to tell you the name real quick, and then I'll let Michael talk. The name of the podcast is Murder in House 2, and it talks about the Marines that were involved with what's commonly named the Haditha Massacre. And it's definitely an interesting story of what happened in Iraq. So without further ado, Michael, introduce yourself.
Thanks, man. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Justin.
Yes, sir.
It's nice to be here. I mean, I really appreciate it very much. I mean, my family's sick of me talking about it, so to be able to talk to you guys is really an honor, and it's nice. I mean, I think that, I came out of it, and I came to this story, first of all, as a civilian who had done, at the time I got involved, as I think I was telling you before we got on, my best friend growing up was in Gulf 25 in the Marine Corps, and he was in the first Gulf War. And John and I had just finished Combat Diary. So I came out of that immersion, and LIMA 325, they were a reserve unit out of Columbus, Ohio. And their fob was the Haditha Dam. So
Right.
I had spent a year. I hadn't been embedded, but I eventually ended up going to Haditha and to the dam, but not with Lima Company.
Right.
But I spent a year kind of being just completely immersed in that, that story, that neck of the woods. Barwana hit, Haklania, Haditha, and telling their story from their perspective and their point of view. And Lima's tour, 325's tour, was from February to around October of 2005. And the company that took over for them was 3-1.
Okay.
And while we were in the edit room finishing up Combat Diary, the Time magazine story broke. I like to say the Haditha Incident. The mainstream press would like to say the massacre, but that story broke. And look, to be honest with you, Marine Corps got caught with their pants down, right? I mean, it's just honest truth. And that was an incident that needed to have been properly investigated at the time. It was not, because of a PAO who lied, frankly, right? And the story happened, and it was just this swirl of, as you know, like these things that happen, right?
Mhm.
Just every media organization, front page of every newspaper, and people were writing about it and talking about it on cable news, like they knew all the answers. And at that point, this was March, April, May of 2005.
Okay.
NCIS hadn't really, I mean, they'd started the investigation, but they didn't finish the investigation to the end of the year, and people had already made up their minds. And the press was leaking, or the Marine Corps actually was leaking a staff sergeant for the squad, Frank Wuterich, as the sort of ringleader of it, and seemed to me already to be pushing off responsibility to him. And so, coming off a combat diary and having told the Lima Marines story and trying to tell it, I don't know how many of your listeners or watchers have seen it. Nobody cares what I think. Like, what I think is the most irrelevant thing in the world, right? I didn't serve that tour. I didn't go. Who gives a fuck? Excuse me, I don't mean to swear.
You're good.
Who cares what I think about the war, what I think about anything? My goal with that film was to let you know what they experienced, what they went through, both before they left, while they were there, and when they came home, right? And for me to get out of the way and just let them tell their story. And that was a really special project for me, and I think for the Marines, both who were in it, but also who saw it, but who were in the unit. I've stayed incredibly close to all of them, weddings and kids being born. And,
Dang.
I don't want to, I'm very careful because stolen valor is a really ugly thing, right? So I'm not, but they're my brothers in some way, but all I did was tell their story. It's hard. I feel very close to them and very protective of them, and I care a great deal about them. And so I sent it to Neil Puckett, who was himself a former Marine. He was a former judge advocate in the Marine Corps, and he was defending Frank at the time. Neil Puckett lives in Alexandria, Virginia. And I said, look, here's my film. It's going to air in a couple of weeks. Take a look. It covers all the same ground. I mean, I have thousands of hours of videotape of this part of the battlefield, of Haditha, Hochland, all this stuff. And I want to make a film about Staff Sergeant Wuterich. And so Neil wrote back, and we had a little bit of back and forth. And I was very clear with him, and I talk about this in the podcast. Like, I don't have a dog in this fight. Like, I don't care if Frank is guilty, and I don't care if he's innocent. Like, this, the system is set and designed to figure that out, not me. You don't need me to do that, right? And I'm not interested in breaking any news at all, right? What I want to do, or what I wanted to do, what I thought I was going to do, turned out, I mean, I've been wrong about some things in my life, but I've never been this wrong about anything.
Oh, wow.
But what I thought I was going to do was say, like, and this was the pitch to Neil, and it was honest, was let me in, because all this is going to play out in public. There's going to be a trial. It's going to be a big trial. Every day there's a new headline in the Post or in the New York Times. 24-hour news is covering it. Fox News, CNN. I don't know if MSNBC was much of anything at that point. But, I don't want to do that. What I want to do is tell the story of the staff sergeant who was at the center of this from behind the scenes. And then when it's over, good or bad, whatever it is, I'll have this portrait. And people will want to know what it was like to be inside that maelstrom. What was it like inside that storm? And, that's it was like a little guerrilla film. That's what I assumed it was going to be. Turned out not to be. Now, I'm talking a lot here, but
It's fine.
So Neil was like, okay, that's kind of interesting. And the Ohio delegation in Congress decided to have a screening of Combat Diary for staffers and everybody in Congress to honor Lima Company. This was Republican, Democrat, everybody in the Ohio delegation of Congress had a screening. And so I said to Neil, like, hey, look, I'm going to be in your neighborhood. You know, we're going to be screening. You want to come to the screening?
Yeah.
And he said, well, let's meet for coffee. So I went to Alexandria. We met at a Starbucks around in his neighborhood. And we sat there for 3 hours talking about the case and about our past. I grew up in Illinois, Chicago. He grew up in Indiana, you know. And Neil, I gave him the pitch, and Neil kind of liked it and then looked at me, and he was very clear. He's like, no, like, this is never going to happen. The answer is no. And he explained to me that the problem was that if the United States government found out that I was filming conversations between Frank and his lawyers, right? At that point, it was just one, Neil. But there were clearly going to be military lawyers who were going to be attached to the case as well, Marine lawyers, defense attorneys. And if the government found out that I was filming those conversations, they would successfully argue that Frank waived his right to attorney-client privilege, right? Attorney-client privilege is everything you say to your attorney is sacred. It's in a bubble. Government doesn't have any access to it. But if you have those conversations around somebody in the media, well, then you've made the decision to let go of that privilege. And anything that you said in front of that media person is subpoenaable, right? It can be brought to court. Like, you know, look, we've all seen the TV shows, right? Anything you say can, you know, you have the right to remain silent, blah, 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 right? And Neil was like, look, they're going to subpoena your video. And you could sit here sipping your left-wing latte and, well, he didn't say that. He was nicer than that. But he's like, look, you can sit here telling me that you're not going to give them the videotape. You spend a night in jail, a week in jail, whatever. I mean, you've got kids, you're married, you know, you're not going to
try to break you.
Yeah, totally. You're not going to rot in jail for Frank Wuterich. No fucking way. And he said the risk was too great because who knows what's going to be on the tape. Neil believed his client was innocent, but God only knows what was going to be there. And as I've said many times, man, like, had I been smart, had I had any common sense, I would have shaken Neil's hand, thanked him for his time, got back to the car, and drove home. But I came up, I said, well, what if I worked? What if I was a part of the defense team? What if we had a contract, right? And I was videotaping for you, right? So what if I was filming all this stuff for you to be taking notes? And, you know, you're in Alexandria, Frank's over at Camp Pendleton, right? In Oceanside. You can't be there all the time. If you let me in, I could go, right? If you need a videotape deposition. And at the time, I really, really, really did not think this. This was like the one disingenuous thing I said to Neil, because I was trying to like land the job, right? But I said, look, if you've got to go to Haditha, if you're going to have to go to Iraq, I'll go for you. Because I was like, I actually didn't think there was any reason to go to Iraq. But he's like, oh, let me, you know, and I said, what we'll do is every videotape I shoot, I'll label property of Neil Puckett, privileged. I'll give you the videotape, right? And I will not, and by the contract, I won't be allowed to even make a copy, right? So by the contract, because I'll be working for you, it'll be your property, and contractually, I'll have to give you the tape. This way, if the government serves me with a subpoena, I'll stand up and say, not only do I not own it, I don't even have it. Go serve Staff Sergeant Wuterich's lawyer with a subpoena for his own work product. And good luck
on that.
Yeah. So up to this point, like from the time that the story broke to before this point right here, like what made you come up with like, dang, I really want to research this story? Like when did that hit you like a light bulb? Like I want to look into this story.
Well, one of the Marines in Lima, who I'm probably the closest to, right? It was Sergeant I don't know what platoon he was in, but anyway, Guy, you know, ended up being an officer. So he was prior enlisted at the time, right?
Okay.
But Guy, and it's in Combat Diary. You know, we ended up putting it in the film. They lost 5 snipers, I think, on August 1st.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I saw that.
Right. And then the Marine Corps, in their infinite wisdom, sent them off on August 3rd. And outside of Barcelona, there was that terrible IED blast when they lost a whole squad, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think the worst IED blast, or worst casualty.
Casualty to date.
I think in the entire Iraq War still.
Dang.
Single incident.
And how many was it? I'm sorry, that passed away.
They lost 11. Their radio man was up with the captain in a different. And they, at that point, Marine Corps had them driving around in Amtrak's. So they
Yeah.
perhaps I mean, they were just basically tin cans, you know, stuffing them in like sardines, and I mean, it was like
Dang.
oil. It was
Yeah.
terrible. And Guy, a couple of weeks later, the intelligence officer was convinced that this one home scouted for this, and Guy was Sergeant Zerk, was sent in to arrest
Dang.
military age males, and it turned out to be a kid.
Mm-hmm.
He was 15 years old.
Jeez.
And Guy, and I loved Guy for this, the honesty, the emotional honesty, and the bravery to tell me the truth, right?
Mhm.
And then there was like a real sense of responsibility in hearing this story. Now, honestly, first time he told it to me was in a bar, but then we talked about it on camera, and you know, he just was so angry, and they were just worn to a nub at this point. That they had 23 KIA in the unit at that point, which is just
Mhm.
insane, right? I
Dang.
mean, like 56 Purple Hearts at that.
Dang.
Yeah, I mean, they were just, you know, right.
Jeez.
Imagine, like, just and the anger, and he knew that
Mhm.
it was going to go probably to Abu Ghraib and then be released, and you know, it was just fuck this shit. And took his M4, pointed it at the kid, took the safety off, and stopped. And just, you know, I think the humanity and the training and just the goodness in him kicked in. And he just said to me, he goes, you know, I put my gun down, and I just thought, it's time to go home. Like, if I do this, I'm no different than them.
Yeah.
And I remember him talking about that in Combat Diary.
Yeah, it's
amazing.
it's an amazing moment. And Guy's an amazing guy. I mean, his mom was the key volunteer for the unit. I became very, very close to her while they were overseas in country. His brother's a first responder. It's just an amazing family. And so to answer your question, Justin, what Guy was really present on my mind while I was filming, and then this story broke, and I thought, oh, okay, well, did Frank respond differently than Guy did, and what happens in it? And I didn't know anything, right? And so I sort of felt like at the time this was a continuation. They were both at the dam. They were both in Anbar. They were both Marine stories. I felt like, oh, this is just like a kind of sequel. That's how I saw it. And so I went to Neil and I gave him that pitch. Now, I think it's important because I may be a documentary filmmaker, but I'm also kind of a journalist, right? I mean, you're in the business of telling the truth still, right? You're not making stuff up. And what mattered to me on the other side of it was that I would have the independence. So the way the deal was structured was, I'm going to shoot everything under your ownership, your auspices. This way, if I get served with a subpoena, it's protected, and you don't have to worry about me. Now, we built up a lot of trust over the years in Neil's family now, right? But at the time, he didn't know me, so I was like, look, you keep the tape. right? And that way, I'm not slipping them off to the side, or I'm making a copy, or I got to earn my trust, right? You got to earn your trust. So you keep the tape, and that's what I think of this process. Now, on the back side of it, I said, when Frank's no longer in danger, when the trial is over, when charges are dropped, like however this thing ends, and you get to decide that he's no longer in legal jeopardy, right? You'll pay me, because I don't want to be physically paid with cash, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to pay for access. I don't want to pay you for access. I want you to be paying me, because then if I go out into the world and they're like, well, Epstein, you made a couple $100 or a couple $1,000 or whatever it is, how are you independent?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And if you paid for access, how do you know they're not like acting out for the camera?
Yeah.
Right? Money starts to pollute everything.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I was like, okay, so Neil, no money can exchange hands. The way you're going to pay me is that when it's over, you're going to give me every single tape I shot, and you can't keep any of them. So if the tapes looks really bad and Frank looks, you can't keep that tape, right? You got to give me everything, and you have no right of review. So I can do anything I want with these tapes, anything. And you have no financial remuneration, which is, if I go off and I make 60 days in and I make all this money on it, you don't get a penny from that. Frank doesn't get a penny, right? Again, no money. And you can't even look at it till it's finished, right? Because again, I don't want somebody to say, hey, you're just another member of the defense team.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to listen to this. So I had to have independence on the other side, journalistic independence.
Yeah.
And so Neil, frankly, nobody had ever done this before. Certainly not inside the military justice system, but I don't think anybody had ever done this inside even the civilian world for a capital offense, for a murder charge or stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So he said, I'm going to have to go look at case law to see if this is going to survive a challenge from the government, from prosecution, if they come after the tape.
Dang.
And he came back a couple of weeks later and says, I can't find anything. So I'll roll the dice. Let's do it. Drop a contract and let's go. And so that's how I got in.
That's awesome.
And for a minute, it just occurred to me 22 minutes and 55 seconds into the recording. And so I'm probably going to have to do an intro to this video. But what's
sorry.
No. That's not you. That's it. It just occurred to me. So we introduced the Haditha incident. What happened? What was the Haditha incident? We know Staff Sergeant Frank. We know it was a fire team. So why don't you tell us what happened in Haditha?
Sure. So on 19 November 2005, there was a crypto change in the morning at a fob in Haditha. That crypto change happened. They were heading back to the dam. There was a 4-vehicle convoy about 7:30 in the morning, thereabouts, and there was an IED blast that blew up the 4th Humvee in that convoy. It instantly killed the A driver, Miguel Terrazas, wounded 2 other Marines in it. And in the immediate aftermath of the IED blast, 24 Iraqi civilians were killed. And that's what I knew going in, right? Now, what the Marine Corps did on 19 and 20 November 2005 was put out a press release that effectively said, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but not much, said that 15 Iraqi civilians died as a result of an IED blast. Letting you believe that, right, if you hear that, if you die as a result of an IED blast, you're either part of the initial explosion or you died afterwards because of wounds or whatever. But many of the civilians were killed in their own bedrooms. They were killed by gunfire, Marine shots, right? There were no insurgents near them, and they were 20 minutes past the ID blast and many hundreds of yards away from it.
Mm-hmm.
And so what ended up happening in this story was that incident came and went. I mean, 1920, I mean, like nobody took any notice of it. That public affairs officer put out that press release. It came and went. Nobody even up the chain of command outside of the battalion took note of it. Nothing, right? So what that meant was at the time, and I think that the Marine Corps ended up suffering a great deal because of this, there was no investigation, right? Had there been an investigation, you would have not had the kinds of questions that the civilian press started to spin afterwards, because there was no known entity. So now in that vacuum, you can put anything in it, right? You can put any nasty story into a vacuum, right? Because, right?
Not seeking out the truth.
Yeah, nature abhors a vacuum. But so all those civilians were buried without autopsies, right? The rooms weren't properly, shell casings weren't cleared, rifles weren't collected, Marines weren't debriefed. There was no after action report of any kind of consequence. And what ended up happening was some Iraqi civilians, potentially of dubious origin, I don't know, but the videotape is the videotape, right? So whatever the intention was, what they recorded was not fabricated, right? They went to the morgue. There were the civilians, many of them children, still in their pajamas, in American body bags, right? And then they went into the room in House 2, which was just blood-soaked at that point. And that video then kind of made its rounds. And in, I think, January of 2006, it eventually found its way to a reporter for Time magazine, Tim McGurk.
Yep.
And Tim went back, he did a basic Google search. And that's the first thing he did was, Haditha Marines. And I think he did November as the third parameter. And he came up with that PAO story. And he was like, well, that doesn't sync, right? Like, how is the room full of blood if they died from an IED blast?
From an IED, yeah.
200 yards away. So he started to poke around, and really, I think it was the military's first clue that something had happened was Tim asking questions. I mean, I think they were blind to it as well.
Dang.
And that began a whole series of internal investigations. And like I said, there was like this vacuum, right? And so the story that came out, and this is, I think, really fascinating to me, because the podcast is about how, in my mind, the Marine Corps unjustly prosecuted the staff sergeant at the center of this whole story. Right? And, look, if you're watching the news and you're somebody, some alert shows up on your phone and it says 24 people have just been shot, some mass shooting here in the States, you kind of ask, okay, well, what happened? Why? Now, there's the tactical things about, like, where the guy got the gun, or what was it, a school or a Walmart, whatever it is. But ultimately, what's the motivation for doing it, right? Because, normal person, healthy person doesn't do that stuff, right? And you start saying, well, go postal. Was he mad? Was he crazy? Was it, revenge? I mean, like hate crime. Like, there's a million things that you start thinking about, but you don't think, oh, it's a normal course of somebody's life. You start to ascribe motivation to it. And I think that's what happened in Haditha, right? You hear 24 civilians, you hear the story that there's a single Marine at who's basically going to be held accountable for all of those deaths. And you think, what's the motivation? So then the press, who's never been to war, right, doesn't understand anything. They're like, oh, there was an IED blast. He lost one of his own. It's an act of revenge. Yeah. Right. And that's the story that sticks. Basically, kind of a crime of passion.
I mean, that's how the Haditha incident was presented. I remember when it happened, and
Absolutely.
I was active duty military when that went down, and I remember, and I'll be honest with you, even bringing you on, and we've talked about it before. Before I hit the record button, is in the beginning when I heard the podcast, the military side of me said, I don't know what is Michael, and I'm sorry for using this
What's
word,
my
but it's such
ulterior
a
motive?
yeah. What's your motive? I mean, is this some crazy and forgive me, but is this some crazy libtard that's trying to make the military out to be this horrible beast? And as I started researching you, there's no greater friend, in my opinion, to the military than you, because you've been telling a story. I mean, you've been telling positive stories of LIMA Company.
Yeah, that was
going to
awesome.
war. Yeah, going to war on PBS with Sebastian Younger was just a honest look at what guys go through. And I'm like, okay, this is after really kind of researching you, I'm like, no, this is not his intention, is to paint the Marines in a negative light. However, it's to call out accountability where accountability needs to be had. And it took a while to finally bring charges against these Marines. I mean, I've been listening to to your podcast. It took a good long time, didn't it?
It did. Well, first of all, let me say, I think there are better friends, but I appreciate the sentiment enormously. I mean, when I get the opportunity to tell someone's story, especially someone who's served, I say this in the best way. I feel like it's a burden, and you better do it right. Burden and an honor, right? I think of like privilege, not in terms of the way it's too often talked about now. Like privilege is an honor. You get to do something, and you better do it right. And so I appreciate the reluctance. I think a lot of people who either currently served or who have served our country in the past feel like somebody's going to come and tell this story with an ulterior motive, right? They're going to be using it to advance their own political opinion effectively. And look, that was the conversation I had with Neil at the beginning, right? Because why are you here?
Yeah.
And that didn't last very long because Neil really liked Combat Diary. I'll be honest, right? and he sort of he understood who I was as a filmmaker, which helped a lot, right? There's no way I would have gotten into this story without that film. Just no. But people have asked me for years, what the hell was Neil thinking? Because it goes off the rails for Neil. This story did not turn out the way he thought it was going to turn out.
Yeah.
And he's a really honorable guy. I mean, he's an amazing guy. And look, politically, he's a Fox News guy. I'm not, right? I'm sort of middle of the road guy, right? But like our Venn diagram doesn't really kind of cross that much, except for this story. But I mean, I'd go to the gates of hell back for Neil Puckett. I absolutely would. I know he would for me. But Neil felt at that moment, I think, Mark, what you feel, which is to say, there are people telling this story in the press right now in 2006, and they're using it, and they're using Frank to attack a war and a culture they don't like. I think what Neil's motivation was, look, I think, we haven't really ever talked about it too much, but he knew he had to defend Frank in a military courtroom, right? But he also knew he had to defend Frank inside the court of public opinion. Right? He's a kid who was 25 years old. He was about to have his third child. He comes home from a tour, and he's labeled, well, I mean, just a mass murderer, killer of babies, the worst of the worst out of the Iraq War. And Neil felt, I think, that, if the world can just see Frank for who he is, I can help him rehabilitate his life when this is all over. And there's two steps to this. There's the immediate step, which is defending him in court. And then, maybe Mike is going to be able to help him on the other side. Now, I told him, look, I'm not going to play that game. If Frank turns out to be that, yeah, sure. I'm not going to lie. I don't have any bias. But if he turns out to be guilty, you roll the dice with me. That's where it's going to go. Right?
I think,
I'm not going to hide that.
and I wish more media was like that nowadays, that they would actually, they can say what they've heard happen, but they can come behind it and say, we're going to actually look into it and find out what the real facts are, what's the truth. And so that, and I feel without them doing that, that really divides America with, just kind of how you said, like, he's a Fox guy. I'm not really, I'm kind of in the middle. And like, that's another way that people really label themselves now, is what news channel they watch. But if they would actually, if the news and media would actually, break down and search and research the story and find the facts instead of, and be not biased about the story, I think that it would help bring us more together and have, more information on like the different stories that are breaking.
I think that's right. Listen, I think, let me say there's a couple things, Justin, to that. I think that that's not the media's responsibility. I think that's all of our responsibility, right? Like we all, I mean, Mark, I want to say thank you for clicking through, right? Because you did the hard work, right? The first instinct is to say, there's bias here. I don't want it. I know this. I don't have to listen to it. I already know what it is. And it takes some, takes something special to say, okay, well, I'm going to take that little bit of a risk. If it turns out I'm right, I can turn away from it, but I'm going to stay open, And I think for me, that's been the real challenge with this story, which is to break through to guys like you. Because look, the left doesn't care about this story. Don't give a shit. They're never going to give a shit. The people I care about, people I'm trying to reach, are folks like you, right? And somehow to sort of say, like, hey, I'm not one of you. I'm not going to pretend, right? But this should matter, because everybody I know who served with honor and served with purpose. And they cared about their training, right? And you have standards, right? And you don't throw those standards away when you take the uniform off, when you put it on, or when you take the uniform off. I mean,
That's right.
And so that's the first thing I'd say, Justin, which is we all have that responsibility, not just the media. But the media is particularly ugly because what they have and what I didn't have here. I may have to stop in 1 second and plug my computer in. 1 sec, right? But let me answer this question, then, if you don't mind. What the media doesn't has is like the deadline, right?
Yeah.
So they're rushing to get it out. So they don't think ever. Like, take the sensational, and then they gotta get it ratings.
Yeah.
Like, you gotta justify everything with money, and you're just sucked into time. And then you don't have the space. Everything's got to be done in, between the two goalposts of the commercial breaks. I mean, the podcast, it's taken me 2 years to write. The story took me 15 years to report, to get right. And that's the thing I love about the podcast, which is it's 10 episodes. And so I get to like break down and really dive. Yeah. And, so if you live in a world where like all you're doing is like rushing, you're not thinking, you're worrying about somebody else going to beat you. And then how many clicks did I get? What are my ratings? And I got to go on to the next one. Well, that's how you get misrepresented the way you guys get misrepresented, right? Because look, if I can't tell your story and have it like be sexy and pop, nobody fucking wants to hear it.
Yeah.
It's other than you, right? I'm going to plug in. So I got battery drain here. So hold on 1 second, guys. Don't go anywhere.
Yep. So while he's plugging in, I'm going to talk to you about the Haditha incident and Staff Sergeant Frank Woodridge. It says, and I'm pulling up, the uber reliable source of Wikipedia. It says, according to news reports, Woodridge was the senior Marine on patrol, no commissioned officers being present. So in other words, he was a sergeant. And after the killings, which we've already discussed, allegedly lied to his commanding officers by stating that 15 of the dead Iraqi civilians were killed in the same IED explosion that touched off the incident. Time magazine has reported that military investigators has placed Woodridge in at least 2 of the houses in which the killings took place. On January 11th, 2006, the Washington Post reported a detailed account about Woodridge's version of events as relayed via his attorney, Neil A. Puckett. Many news reports have contradicted Woodridge's version of events. So basically, that is really what we're getting at. The whole point of Murder in House 2 is we are breaking down the. Are you okay, Justin? Okay, sorry. Sorry. I just look up and he's like going crazy. But anyway, that's the whole point in Murder in House 2 is to break down the government's case on what happened during his trial, and it's been a very, very, oops, I might have just, sorry if I just went somewhere.
There you go.
Okay, am I back? Hello. Okay, sorry about that. And that's what. Oh, go ahead, brother.
Yeah. So listen, I mean, I think, and then we should talk a bit about really. I mean, first of all, Frank didn't lie to anybody. I mean, he's not the author of the 15 or 13 Iraqi civilians in the IED blast, and he was ordered to clear south because the lieutenant for the platoon showed up in the part of the QRF, right? And like all these details were not part of any of the news reports. But there was one interesting thing, and then I want to circle back to the podcast a little bit and the drama of it, is there was in early news reports, and I don't know how it got planted in, right, about an old man who was in a wheelchair, who was killed in one of the homes. Now, I have still, because I was a member of the defense team, so for the entire time of the investigation and then afterwards, access to all the photographs. I think there's about 15 or 16,000 pages of discovery. I've been in the homes. There was never an old man in a wheelchair. Now, which is not to say that even members of the own defense team ultimately did think that someone had committed murder, right? In the totality of this. And that's, I think, the problem here, which is that there's gray, right? It's not all, everybody on one side isn't right and everybody on the other side isn't right. You know, everybody's wrong. That's the problem. Like, everybody's wrong. But you have this thing of like this supposedly old man in a wheelchair getting killed. For years, he's talked about. When Frank's trial ended, you know, all these people went on national news, talked about, oh, what about the old man in the wheelchair? The Washington Post put it in, you know, the San Diego Star-Ledger had it in. There is no old man in a wheelchair. There is no man in a wheelchair. Nowhere. It does not exist. And now an old man was killed by a fragmentary grenade, but he's not in a wheelchair. And so you get these weird facts that kind of seep in and then, you know, just get bandied about and passed from one news organization to the next because that's how they fact check. Well, it was in this one, so it must be true. And so once it gets somehow sucked into the system, it's impossible to dislodge it. But what ends up happening is around, as you say, you know, the investigation went on for about a year. And in December of 2006, charges were preferred against 4 enlisted Marines. And Frank was charged with 18 counts of non-premeditated murder, right? Basically, the Marine Corps, the U.S. government said Frank was a mass murderer.
Yeah. And
Frank, and this was the drama for years inside the defense. Nobody knew this. It wasn't so much that Frank said he was innocent, right? The problem was that Frank said he couldn't remember.
Yeah, and you really hit that on this latest episode, or one of the latest episodes.
Yeah, I mean, which just frankly bothered us to no end. Frank had 2 Marine lawyers, right? One was Lieutenant Colonel Colby Vokey, who's from Dallas, Texas, great guy. The other was Major Haitham Faraj, who himself was prior enlisted, who had been a rifle,
Okay.
right? Been a grunt, and he approached the case. He was an officer. He'd gone to law school at that point. He had tried a lot of defense cases. He's a brilliant guy, but here was their mount training, mobile operations in urban terrain. Had kicked in. They thought they were assaulting a hostile place. So Haitham looked at the whole case from his perspective as a fellow grunt, right? Not as a lawyer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed incredible to all of us that Frank could not remember what happened in a house where he theoretically, according to the government, fired his weapon and shot all his kids. Like, why can't he remember? Can he not remember because what he did it and like his PTSD? He cannot remember because why can't he remember? Can he remember and he's just lying to us? Right. And if that's the case, well, why is he lying to us? Is he lying to us because he did it and he doesn't want us to know? Is he lying because he's covering up for somebody else? I mean, we would talk about for years. And part of it is if you haven't served, and this is where when I talk to civilians about the case, they just glaze over, right?
Mm-hmm.
The IED happened and there was a white vehicle, and you start to take apart the incident and you realize it's not one incident. It's actually 4 separate incidents, right? As combat in these kinds of environments is. I'm sorry, Justin.
The IED bomb in 3 different houses?
So the IED blast happens, and there was a white vehicle that had pulled off the side of the road to let the convoy go through, and there were 5 Iraqi military-age males, MAMs, who had pulled off, and they were out of the car. And almost in the immediate after, like 90 seconds or so after the blast, the Marines shot and killed those men.
Okay.
And
2 houses in the car.
They were just in the car. Frank said that he believed that they were turning to run, which within the ROE would have justified, look, running from an IED blast is hostile intent, at least, if not hostile act. Mm-hmm. And so that was the first one. Now we can talk about that because the government doesn't charge Frank with what he says he did, right? Which was taking a knee, seeing 5 military-age males running from an IED blast, and believing that they're hostiles. Mm-hmm. You shouldn't be running, right?
Oh yeah.
Now they had another Marine coming at them hard, screaming at them, not following his training. I think Sonic Delacruz at the time was a corporal, and I think that those men were probably running from Delacruz, yelling at them.
Mm-hmm.
But what the Marine Corps does, and this is what makes the front page of the Washington Post, right, is the Marine Corps says Frank walked up to those military-age males, all 5 of them, made them get on their knees, made them put their hands above their heads or behind their heads, and executed all of them at close range, right? And that's how Frank's charge sheet looked, right? And then they leaked that charge sheet to the Washington Post with photographs, right? So if you go to Wikipedia, that's still up, right? Now, here's the crazy thing about this story, and I knew this within 60 days of Frank's charges being preferred. None of the government's own forensic evidence supported those charges.
Mm-hmm.
Like the government's own forensics told a radically different story. They did not line up at all with the government's own charges. So it wasn't like, oh, here are a bunch of defense experts that are going to challenge that, and here are a bunch of defense experts that are... No, the government's own experts undermined the government's own case.
Mm.
Right? And then they took small arms fire from the south, and they believed it was across a ravine, a wadi, pretty steep wadi in this case, And one of the Marines sort of marked the house, and then they were ordered by the lieutenant who showed up in the QRF to clear south. So that was the first house. That was called House 1. And while they were in House 1, they threw a fragmentary grenade into a sitting room, and there were families. There was a family in there, and they then saw what they thought was an insurgent in their mind. Turned out not to be, running behind the house, and somebody yelled "runner," and so they went in pursuit of it. They got out. They couldn't see anybody. They didn't see a trail of anybody. It was just empty. And they ran in the direction that they thought the insurgent ran. And they skipped many houses. Like House 1 and House 2 are not next to each other. They're not adjacent. You cannot see House 2 from House 1. Dang. You got out of the back of it, and they ran, and they got to another house where they thought the insurgent had gone in, had not. Somebody knocked on the door. That Iraqi family followed standard procedure, which was, knock and clear at the time. All the women went into one room, closed the door. The male of the house opened the door, let the Marines in to clear the house, check for weapons caches, all that stuff. They shot that guy 7 times when he opened the door to his own home. And then somehow, somebody, in the back bedroom, there were 5 children and 2 women. No guns, no insurgent. Somebody walked in. They were all on the bed, according to Mike Maloney, who was the NCIS special agent who was in charge of forensic reconstruction for that house. Somebody stood at the foot of the bed and sighted targets. It was clear as day. There was no fragmentary grenade. There was no residue of a blast. The sun was up. The windows had no curtains on them. They stood at the foot of the bed, and they executed 5 children on their mother's bed.
Throughout your time researching this story, when you were finally able to go to the incident in House 1 and House 2, like, how did that make you feel, like, actually going into these places that you've been researching and being behind the scenes for so long, and finally getting able to go to the exact spot where it happened?
It's a good question. I'll be honest with you, right? That whole experience, I mean, I went for 2 reasons. Well, really, I went for 1 reason. Frank couldn't remember. The government said that Frank was the guy that stood at the foot of the bed and executed the family, right? And when you go through the forensics of that scene, right, there aren't like spray bullet holes in the walls behind them, right? Somebody is sighting targets of children and shooting children. So it's not, you know what you're doing, right? And I mean, like, by the end, you got to know what you're doing. Maybe not the first shot, but and all of those children have headshots, every single one of them. And that's why I say, like, standards, right? Like, there isn't a Marine I know who served who would say that's what we do. There's not a single one. And if somebody's done that person has not followed their training. That is not who we are. That is not who we are as Americans. That's not who we are as Marines. And you serve with honor. And if somebody commits murder, they're not serving with honor. They're not a Marine anymore, right? And they should be punished, right? We're a nation of laws. And you understand the fog of war if you've served. I don't at all. I don't pretend to know what it is, but I would hopefully have the empathy, the ability to understand and say, okay, like, that's so much gray. Like, how am I to judge? Right? I can't judge. So anyway, to answer your question, government put Frank in that room. Yeah. They put Frank at the foot of the bed. And Frank's answer for years was, I can't remember, which was insane. I cannot tell you how, like,
frustrating.
Yeah. I mean, like, how can you not remember that? How in God's name can you not remember that? Like, it's not about like, did you have a burrito on Tuesday or was it a taco, right? Like, I don't know. It was some Mexican food. Like that I get. Like the government's saying you're going to go to jail, but you're going to spend the rest of your life in Leavenworth. That's it. Your defense is, I forgot? What the fuck? Seriously, what the fuck? So the feeling was that I had, by that point, Frank and I had become pretty close. I had spent tons of time with him, right? I mean, you'll find out, guys, later. I mean, next week's episode, this investigation ended his marriage. I'd followed him all the way through his divorce, and his wife took the kids. And I mean, he was broken at that point that we went. We were close. And I like Frank. Let me just also say this. Frank Woodrich, I really like him. Now, if that's bias, that's bias. Like, whatever it is. But boy, was I frustrated. So the feeling was, we got to send him. We got to put him in those rooms again. And maybe that, at long last, will jog his memory. So I was in that room thinking, like, is this going to do it? Like, it was a weird moment. It was like, I've had a lot of weird moments in my career, but that was weird, right up there, right? Because you're in that room and you're like, holy shit, this is it. And you better get it right. And so you're not really thinking about much.
At this point, when you're actually in there, had you already seen the pictures and got the pictures from the guy who was holding on to him?
Oh, yeah. So, like, at that point, I don't know if is this better, worse?
It's better. It's better.
Better? Okay. Looks like I'm being interrogated now. Sorry. Hold on. All right. There we go. So, we got all the discovery. The charges were preferred in December of 2006, and in early 2007, we got all the discovery. Yeah. And in that discovery were the photographs that were taken by Lance Corporal Andrew Wright in the immediate aftermath. And he was an interesting guy. He's also a hero, as far as I'm concerned. A guy with a real moral backbone. Like he's the best of the best. He was somebody who had been through Fallujah 2, right? He'd been Second Battle of Fallujah. He'd been 3-1. This was his third tour, I believe. He knew right from wrong. And he walked into that room and he was like, this is not right. This is not what I was trained to do. And he had been through Fallujah and he just was like, what the fuck? And he took pictures. Now, he says he was ordered to take the pictures. I don't know that that's true, frankly, but it doesn't really matter. And he held on to them for a long time because no one came knocking. Nobody cared. So, yeah, I had everything. And that's why you'll hear. We get into the room and Frank, I'll come back. I'm kind of curious what you guys think because Frank tells me something in that room that blows the case wide open. He says something for the first time in 3 years that we're like, what? Like, what? We were just stunned. And I got back to Al-Assad. I put the videotape in a military pouch and sent it back to Pendleton because, it was going to take me forever to get out of Iraq. The trial was about to happen. The day got delayed like 1,000 times. So, but I needed Neil to get that tape and Hatham. So Colby and I were in Iraq. With Captain Newt Bonner, who's moved on. But Colby and I were in Iraq. Neil and Hatham were back at Pendleton. I needed him to see the tape. He got the tape. He was like, oh my God. And that made them go back into the discovery. Things that they had gone over hundreds and hundreds of times. I can't tell you how many times. They were ready. Trial was 2-3 weeks away at that point. And then because of what Frank said in that room, they found something else in the discovery that they had missed. And all of a sudden, man, I don't want to ruin it for you guys. Nothing. All of a sudden, they realized, holy shit, Frank's been lying to us. And there's other Marines.
Episodes to come out?
There'll be 10 in all. So we dropped 6 this week. Today was, I got to tell you guys, for me, it was this weird ass journey because I walked in, as I said, thinking like, okay, like I'm just a passive observer. Like, who cares what I think?
Mhm.
But it became pretty clear, like at Roadside, right? Like, what the fuck is going on that Frank is being charged with something that the government's own forensic experts say he didn't do? How the hell are they going to do that? They're going to get into a courtroom. They're going to have these charges against Frank. The NCIS is going to take the stand and say, no, 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 it didn't happen that way. Like, nothing. It didn't make any sense. Like, it was so frustrating and confusing because you're usually in a case like this, and you're like, oh, prosecution's doing this, and then the government's got all this shit, and they're lying, and they're going to get the guy that's innocent. But like, what are you going to do? You're going to put Special Agent Brady on the stand.
Yeah.
He's your guy.
Mhm.
And he's going to say you're lying? Like, and then it really got ugly later. And so I was so upended by the time this thing was over that, and I didn't have access to the NCIS investigators, right? Because I was on the defense side.
Yeah.
And so I spent years trying to get Mike Maloney and Tom Brady to sit down for interviews. Now they were very senior NCIS special agents at that point, forensic investigators. Both of them were former Marines, right? Had served 20 years in the Marine Corps and then were at NCIS. They were deeply loyal. They knew what it meant to be in a rifle company. As I said, Mike was a drill instructor at Lejeune, at Parris Island. They knew what they were doing. They knew who they, you know what I mean? And I needed them. And this episode today, or this week that dropped, you guys can
the stippling. Yeah.
No. Oh, yeah, the stippling one. Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The stippling test. Fuck. When he told me that story, I was like,
I know you can't say too much more because the other episodes haven't come out. But
I was actually going to say,
after they come out, we would love to have you come back because I want to hear more about when you can talk more about after the episode there.
Well, yeah, actually, I was thinking that's a good point because we're at a little bit over an hour anyway, and we want people to stay interested and stay intrigued. So let's circle back after the 10th episode, and we'll have you back if you're okay with that, and we can finish because then there's a lot of stuff you can talk about that you don't want to ruin it for us now. So listen, go to your podcast providers, Murder in House 2. Before we let you go, Michael, how can people access it? Would you like to plug your social media, anything like that?
Yeah, please. So listen, let me just say this.
Okay.
I can real quickly. I got finished and I made the film and no one gave a shit. Right. I could not. The reason there's a podcast is no one wanted to hear this story. Right. They didn't want to hear that. They didn't care about any of it. And that's on me and my world. Right. I think, which is to say the documentary film world. So I was committed to making sure this story got told, and that's why this podcast exists. So you can listen to it anywhere you get podcasts. If you listen to your podcast through Spotify, it's on Spotify. If you listen through Apple Podcasts, it's on Apple Podcasts. If you've got any of your crazy podcasting apps, Google Play, it's everywhere. It's called Murder in House 2. I think it's pretty dramatic. I hope it's well told. I hope it's told with some honor and sensitivity and some, no bias. Well, eventually, I got to be honest with you, there is bias in the sense that I was part of Staff Sergeant Wooterich's defense team. Yeah. And I spent 6.5 years with him and his family. And I'm not going to hide the fact that Frank became someone I became close to and that I like. Yeah. And even though he was at the center of the investigation, Neil, Hatham, Colby, these guys, I all consider them friends. Right? So if there's bias, there's pro-Marine bias here in the podcast. Every single person is a Marine or a former Marine, except yours truly. And so, listen to it. Social media handles are all Murder in House 2. And we're putting up video of it. We're putting special episodes up as well for people to listen to, documents, things like that on Facebook and Twitter, Instagram, Murder in House 2. And as we go along, maybe we do this together even. People have questions, they can always DM me. My Twitter handle is Viewfinder NYC. Viewfinder like a camera, NYC like the city that I live in. Don't hold that against me. But what I'm going to try to do is answer questions for people when this is all over. If they've got lingering questions, because it's a mind fuck it'll blow your mind how episode 10 plays out.
And another thing, if you want to ask questions, put it in the comments as well, because we can write them down. We can definitely bring it back when we circle around and do this second interview. We can definitely say, hey, these are the questions that you guys have. All right. Well, that's it. Love you guys. Thank you for tuning in. Once again, Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. And
check out that podcast.
Yeah, check out the
thanks
podcast.
For having, listen, honestly, no shit. Thanks for having me. It means a lot to me, and it matters a great deal. You spend too much of your time sitting in a mushroom cellar thinking nobody's going to listen or care. So I'm really grateful.
And I will give Michael this much credit. I hit him up, and he hit me back pretty much immediately that he wanted to be on the podcast YouTube channel. So the guy is approachable just because, he's this big filmmaker in New York City. The guy is seriously approachable. So he's a friend of Awkward Fist Bump Productions, and he's a friend of the military person. So love you guys, and we will talk to y'all later. Boom.